So thank you, everybody, for coming to this panel today. I just want to start by letting everybody know that this panel is being recorded for posterity's sake. So please do mute your microphones if you're not talking. And if you don't want to appear on the recording, feel free to turn off your cameras. And then I should start by noting that we're gathered here, some of us physically present on and all of us using resources extracted from the traditional territories of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, caretakers of this land since time immemorial. And I hope that in addition to acknowledging this fact and how we benefit from this ongoing displacement, this series of speakers and workshops, of which this panel is a part of, will help move us towards more concrete action for reconciliation by learning about and exploring how power and privilege are implicated in our professional values and practices. Given my own positionality as a cisgendered man, as a person of East Asian heritage who's often treated as white, as a disabled person, but also as a person with the privilege of employment security, given this positionality, I try to understand my work as contributing to a social good. I hope that we all see our work contributing to a social good, but who is included in the scope of the social? If that work doesn't include or address those pushed to the margins of our society, then who is it really working for? I don't want to be, and I hope that none of you want to be, remembered as the intellectual wing of settler colonialism, of the intellectual wing of white supremacy or heteropatriarchy. I hope that this series and this panel in particular can help us become more reflexive about our relationships with fellow researchers and with everyone with whom we share society. Today, I'm pleased to introduce three distinguished panelists who will share their insights and discuss the topic of just research relationships. I'll provide a brief introduction for each of them before turning the mics over to them to ask them to introduce themselves and just talk a little bit about the perspective from which they're contributing to this discussion. And then we'll go into some question and answer. Daniel and I have prepared several questions to ask the panelists. Following that, we'll turn over the questions to the audience. But before I introduce the panelists, I'd also like to note that, as I've said multiple times, this panel is part of a series of speakers and workshops hosted by the Games Institute, particularly the Anti-Racism, Decolonization, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusivity Committee of the Games Institute, and supported by an SSHRC Connections grant, of which Daniel Harley, who you see in the video, is also a principal on, and whom all of the members of the ADE committee contributed to the realization of that grant and therefore the speaker series. Please do look to the GI events website for future announcements about future events in that series. So now I'd like to introduce our distinguished panelists today, starting just with the order that you saw them on the poster. First, we have Dr. Kashona Gray. Kashona Gray is an associate professor of writing, rhetoric, and digital studies and Africana studies at the University of Kentucky. She's also a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. Dr. Gray is the author and co-editor of numerous books and articles, including her foundational 2014 work, Race, Gender, and Deviance on Xbox Live, Theoretical Perspectives from the Virtual Margins, and 2018's edited collections, Woke Gaming with the University of Washington Press, and Feminism Play with myself at Palgrave Macmillan Press, with myself and Emma Bosson at Palgrave Macmillan. And most recently, the groundbreaking Intersectional Tech Black Users of Digital Gaming, which I believe is NYU Press. Yeah. Joining Dr. Gray is Dr. Liz Nelson. For the past 3 years, Dr. Nelson has been Assistant Vice President of Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Affairs here at the University of Waterloo. In this role, she has been part of the academic leadership team in the Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Affairs that supports graduate education and community, as well as grad-related initiatives that align with the university's strategic planning. Outside of the administrative role, Dr. Nielsen is a professor in the Department of Psychology and with a team of graduate students conducts research on children and adolescents' sociocognitive development. Joining Drs. Gray and Dr. Nielsen is Dr. Rona Herring, who is a professor in the School of Public Health Sciences in the Faculty of Health and a fellow with the Dietitians of Canada. Rona's research involves evaluation of school community and policy-based interventions that support healthy eating for Canadian youth, especially those living in First Nations communities. And her current teaching and research activity explores decolonizing education and healthcare practices. A recipient of the UW Award for Excellence in Graduate Studies and, in Excellence in Graduate Supervision, and former Associate Dean of Graduate Studies, Rona counts mentorship as one of her career highlights. Thank you all so much for joining us, Rona, Liz, and Kishona. And I wonder if you might just take between 2 to 5 minutes to briefly introduce yourselves and talk about what perspective you would bring to this conversation on just research relationships.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you, Gerald, for having us, for connecting us. I'm always glad to share space with you lovely humans up there at GI. And, I really love, this panel. I don't think we talk enough about relationships and like the power behind like relationships, especially in academic settings. So I've found, the work that I've been doing, I work a lot with students, work a lot with communities. And so this is like a conversation that's all ever present and always on my mind. I'm always thinking about that. So just broadly, a lot of my work, of course, is, it's in the gaming space, look at, social interactions in those spaces. And like at the core of that, I look at how power impacts those relationships and how power impacts connectivity and how like the affordances like of the technology also play a role in facilitating, those relationships. So I have found when I started like doing a lot of this work, I found that methods weren't the methods that we used that were at my disposal at the time. They weren't really now they were wonderful. No shade to the canon and all the methods, but I found that I had to piecemeal together some approaches because there wasn't like an intersectional focus or a decolonial like focus really to help me think about my role as a researcher. With the few privileges that I might have, but also like the role of like deconstructing like power. So I really I had to. The research that I did forced me to have like an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, anti-discipline, whatever you want to call it. I call myself the undisciplined one. But I realized that I had to piecemeal some things together in order to come to a holistic whole to really address conversations of white settler colonialism, to address like power, privileges, like an oppression inside my work. So I'm really glad to have this conversation and to bring folks together to engage in these conversations.
I can go next if we're going in the same order. Yeah, I'm really pleased to be here. And I think this is an excellent topic. We know that respectful relationships, supervisory relationships, are really key to a thriving academic community. We know that they're important to the successful completion of graduate programs. And we also know that they're so important for student well-being. So when I think about my experience in this space, I kind of operate on the two poles of the continuum. So on the one side, I get to celebrate all the great supervision that happens at our institution, get to take part in the workshops related to graduate supervision and hear from some of the people who have won the supervision awards. And on the other side, I support students who have come into challenges with their supervisors, thinking through whether it's like something that's happening at an individual level or something that's happening within the department, and try and navigate through it. And when we think about like those types of situations, the concepts of power always come into play because there's almost always a risk to the student in coming forward when there are relationship issues. And so part of that is working collaboratively to figure out how to navigate through that so that we mitigate that risk and have a successful outcome for all individuals. I thought you might be interested in just kind of hearing generally how the University of Waterloo is doing. So I took a quick look at the 2022 data on graduate supervision at our institution here. And so we're about on par with other institutions where we have, 87 to 90% of graduate students endorsing some sort of positive relationship that they have with their supervisors. So like good, very good, or excellent. But that means that there's 10% that are really feeling unsatisfied in their relationship. And then if you look at whether students would work with the same supervisor, we have 75% choosing that they would work with the same supervisor. So although we're on par with other U15 and other Canadian institutions, there's still room for improvement in what we do here. In terms of my personal sort of place in this, I'm in a profession, clinical psychology, that is being publicly called as to kind of speak and think about the exclusive practices that we have in terms of who we admit to our profession and the degree to which we might not be responding to the needs of society because of this. So I would say I'm very much going through some reflection in terms of how I operate in my own lab and how my profession kind of operates, and doing that collaboratively with the other people that I work with. And certainly whenever we talk about initiatives at the graduate level at the institution, I just want to be clear that I partner with the EDIR office and the Office for Indigenous Relations, just to make sure that what we are putting in place is appropriate and works in a positive way. Thanks.
Okay, hi, and I'll jump in here and thanks, Gerald, for the introduction. One of the other things that I've been doing in the last year and a half since I finished my 6 years in total as the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies for our faculty, the Faculty of Health, was to be the strategic plan implementation lead for our faculty in terms of equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-oppression, recognizing, of course, that I come from an abundance of privilege that I did nothing whatsoever to earn. But by way of just giving you a little bit of background, I'm a nutritional scientist by training. And for the last 30 years, I've had the privilege within my research space of working with First Nations communities from across what we now call Canada. And when I reflect on that, sort of the fundamental principles for success are respect, reciprocity, and relationships. And when I think of respect, it's certainly respect for peoples, knowledges, and communities, but respect for culture, respect for connection to the land, respect for a lot of the protocol and ceremonies that are part of working with Indigenous communities. In terms of reciprocity, it's very much an equal partnership, or certainly that's what we strive for within the research. We're governed by the First Nations principles of OCAP, which is ownership, control, access, and possession, and I'd add participation, because of course the data are owned by the First Nations communities. This is work that's meant to be by them and for their benefit. But within our own research group, we have spirit of collaboration protocols. Some of them are fairly simple, some of them are more elaborate, that we set up to guide our community work. And the final one is relationships. And of course, Indigenous peoples it's a very relational culture. But I think that it's actually when you spend time to get together and get to know each other as individuals, that you set the stage, for a real learning, a mutual learning, and a sharing that's so beneficial to move work in this space forward. So there's the exact same three principles, I would say. The respect, reciprocity, and relationships are so critical to the graduate student supervisor relationship or relationships within the research space. So of course we aspire to mutually respectful relationships, reciprocity, and certainly I learn a lot from my graduate students. It's not by any means one-way street, and relationships are just absolutely, you know, so critical. I've had 14 PhD students for whom I've been the immediate supervisor, and great number of master's students, and I don't think I've ever taken on a student that I didn't meet with, or at least, you know, have conversations with, and depending on geography, before they came to work in my lab, just to kind of get a sense of our interests and our styles and whether they're aligned. And absolutely every single graduate student and every relationship is different, and you tailor it to the specific needs of that student. But I think it's so important. I always ensure that they have a chance to meet with other members of my graduate student team, just to ask those questions and to determine if this looks like a good space for them. But continuing to foster those relationships through just group meetings, through going to conferences together, through field travel together, through, you know, celebrating the different milestones of for the members of the graduate team. Those, I think, are just so critical to just making it a really pleasant relationship, but also to foster that kind of environment that you hope will allow people to come forward if something's bothering them. So that's what I wanted to say by way of introduction. Looking forward to the discussions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rona. And you know, that's really a great bridge to some of the questions that I'd like to begin the discussion with. You know, because ultimately, well, sorry, not ultimately, but within the last few years, particularly, researchers in the humanities and social sciences, more than perhaps researchers in the table sciences, but academics generally in the last 5 to 10 years have been asked to start thinking about how to practice more just research relationships with the communities outside of the university. And so your discussion of your work with Indigenous communities really brings to mind that sort of non-extractive relationship. But we're not often tasked with applying those same principles to people within our institutions, particularly with people at different ranks and different positions of power within those institutions. So if I could get you all to address maybe the first question, you know, how can we recognize and respond to the asymmetries of power, the asymmetries of institutional power, but also, I suppose, of social power that show up with different people inside our institutions? How can we recognize and respond to those asymmetries of power between colleagues of different rank, students and staff of in our university settings, when often our research groups and our teams are made up of people from across these disparities?
I think that's an important question. But I also, especially being in the institution for like a little while, I realized that a lot of our goals are mostly incongruent with the goals of the university and the institution, right? And so I've always had to find ways to make, and of course the burden falls on, you know, the most vulnerable, minoritized, like, you know, folks that are in the university, to have to like start the conversations to fix, you know, like a lot of these things. But I realized that where we have to start is to find the common question. You know, what's the thing that we are all invested in? And I think that's like the jumping off point, like to identify like a lot of the issues. Now, some of this is influenced by like the DEI questions, right? You know, of course, you know, we all like do DEI, but how we do it and what the end goals are, I think, are different. And so I really think it's important for us to like, you know, have, you know, a lot of those like conversations like, okay, you want to diversify. What does that mean when they're here? You know, what kinds of connections are they going to have? What kind of experiences are they going to have, you know, once they're in that space? And I think it goes back to that, to the B part of DEI, which I love that folks have included, the belonging part, right? Which I think it's a necessary like addition and component. But I think that there are also, some useful things that we can bring into like, our practices of like, especially in our research practices. And I want to make sure I understand like, like the question too, Gerald, but, I just wanted to answer it like in this way. We have to constantly remind the universities that, hey, we have populations here who are vulnerable and are being impacted, whether intentionally or unintentionally, by the practices like of the university. And so we have to like remind them that, like, okay, there are people here who are hungry, there are people here who have like needs to be met. And I think, as researchers, we spend too much time up here and we forget about the everydayness. So like for one thing that I do in my research projects, I don't mobilize and start a research project if I don't have like a social worker or a counselor that's there, especially if I'm working with communities. Because one of the biggest things that I think is so important, and I don't have capacities. I'm not a counselor. There are so many things that, that pop up, and I want to make sure that their needs are addressed. So think about like people being vulnerable and sharing their stories with us. And then we just write that down and we're like, oh, okay, thanks for sharing that. And then, we translate that into something like in a paper, and then we publish it, we add it to our CV, and then we've gone on to the next thing. And these folks are still hungry. These folks are still, thinking about the thing that just happened to them. So I felt like, we have like a responsibility, to communities, because we're extracting and exploiting so much. I'm like, what's the little bit that I can give back? Identifying resources is like an important thing, and more than just a $50 gift card. Like, I don't know why that makes me mad. Listen, them $50 gift cards are not doing anything. So I know whenever I have like, like if I'm doing like interviews, with like different community groups, I'm going to feed them, I'm going to feed them like a real meal. I'm not just going to have pizza. Like, let me get some, get some fried chicken and, get some greens or something, get some things that the communities actually eat and that they want, and so I think that identifying a needs assessment is really huge before we start any project, before we connect with anything. And that just goes not only with communities, but also inside our spaces. Our staff, our staff are some of the most overworked and underpaid people. What are their needs? I think we have to just constantly, do that reflective, kind of work to really make sure that we are, attending to, the needs, especially of people who run our shows, right? I overwork my staff. I know that. So I always want to make sure that I do that. I'm not sure if that's the direction you wanted to go, Gerald, but that's how my spirit moved to answer that question.
Gerald, I don't know if you want to like have us. I don't think we necessarily need to like all answer every question, but I took that question in a different way, and I loved what you said, Krishana. Thank you for that. When I thought about that, I thought about the power differential between a supervisor and a student, and I think we need to acknowledge that power differential is there and that it has important implications. There was an article that came out in Nature a couple of years ago that talked about the mental health crisis for graduate students. And one of the key factors in driving this is the relationship they had with their supervisor. So like 40% of graduate students having clinically significant levels of anxiety and depression, and the important role of supervisors. So it exists. Supervisors do have a lot of influence over their graduate students. And so when we think about this, I can think of what are the practices to kind of decrease the ways in which power could potentially be abused within that context. And so I think of making explicit what might be implicit. So having clear expectations so that we're not just basing decisions on like the gut reaction of a particular supervisor who might be reacting more on emotions than some clear criteria. How do we increase the predictability for graduate students so that they know what to expect? And how do we set expectations that are consistent across supervisors for a particular program? Are they using the same sort of rubric or preset criteria? Same for admissions. Are we just meeting people and saying, I like them, they kind of seem like me, so I'm going to invite them into my lab? Or do we have like predetermined criteria that we're looking at? And I think it's important to have these conversations at the program level. And I also think it's important to use committees where possible so that there's less chance for idiosyncratic decisions that could be biased and affecting students in a negative way. And then we need to hold each other accountable at the departmental level. Like the culture, you know, the culture of a department is kind of dictated by the types of supervisory relationships that exist within it. And then I think finally we need to be really transparent about how decisions are made. So for authorship and other things. So I see those as all sort of ways that we decrease that power imbalance between supervisor and student, but also recognize that there needs to be some boundaries between supervisor and student. Because if I think about where challenges sometimes come into play, it's because a situation started where, you know, there was kind of not boundaries there, and then a supervisor is in a position where they have to provide negative evaluation or feedback in a particular way, and that feels very uncomfortable when there's not certain boundaries that are put in place along the line. So those are my thoughts. A different direction to that question.
Certainly. Thank you, Liz. Yeah, and you know, thinking about boundaries, there's absolutely something to be said about the good-natured camaraderie of the PI who wants to be you know, friendly, but there's also a risk when you break down those boundaries of you know, lowering defenses and not just thinking about but thinking about how that can, you know, that can produce situations in which emotional and psychological abuse are much more powerful and effective because you have gone outside of the boundaries of the professional relationship, and you have invited these people into personal relationships, which ultimately are still you know, under the umbrella of a power differential, of a hierarchical relationship. So I very much appreciate that that focus on boundaries there. So Rona, would you care to add anything to this?
It's such fabulous points, and of course that's a great thing about panels. Everybody comes at this from a slightly different perspective. And when I was reflecting on the question, I was thinking that there's a big role of leadership too in setting an environment that sort of, you know, fosters more inclusion. Just, you know, simple things. If I think of the school that I'm in, you know, we absolutely have undergrad and graduate students on our department meetings, on hiring committee, on all of those, and they're very much respected members of the team. One of the things that I'm proud of, and I think institutions everywhere are on a real learning curve, and there's a long way for us to go. But one of the things I'm proudest of, if I think of University of Waterloo in the last year, is this commitment to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. But it's not, I mean, we have Indigenous people on our Senate, on our Board of Governors. So this is not just, we're going to try and recruit more Indigenous students, or we're going to try and recruit more staff and faculty, but it's actually this recognition of engagement at different levels of the institution, which I think is you know, really a nice step, you know, in the right direction. So that was just a slightly different kind of sort of thought about also just setting the stage for less hierarchical relationships.
Yeah, thank you. That's another great point that draws our attention right to another just another dimension of how we can think about these relationships. I want to maybe ask one more question before we turn it over to the audience for their questions. So I think I'll ask, how do you think that we can leverage our own power as researchers, as PIs, but also existing university policies and guidelines to advocate for students who are experiencing bad relationships, who are experiencing non-extractive or otherwise unfortunate relationships with their supervisors or even with peers within their research groups. What tools can we bring to bear to help these students out?
Maybe
Rhoda,
just
do
to
you want to go
change,
first?
oops, yeah, I was just thinking to change things up. Maybe I'll start and just respond to that one. I think as universities, we're much better at, having the mechanisms for problems once they occur. So we've got appeals procedures and grievances and protocols around change of supervisor and those sorts of things. But, I'm in a school of public health. My focus is prevention. And I think that that's where we're really not as good. And we really have to think about that up front. One of the aspects is just being aware of some of what goes on, which is part of it. But setting up the kind of structures that can happen. I was actually trying to find out today, because at one point when Liz and I were sitting around similar tables, there had been a checklist that we'd been circulating, and I don't see it in our current grad handbook, but it's something that we've talked about, and we do bring up in our ads workshops, these workshops for new faculty who are wanting to go on to supervise doctoral students. We bring up this sort of checklist of things that you should be having conversations with students with at those initial meetings, like authorship on papers, like finances, like attendance at conferences, and some of those difficult conversations, expectations in terms of hours spent working in the lab, and also that chance for being open to the fact that these are individuals and maybe they're parents and maybe they do need to work 20 hours a week outside of their work as a graduate student just to make ends meet, and they have other constraints on their lives, and sort of setting up a better stage for kind of truly understanding each other's context and expectations. So I think those kind of things could go a long way. Thanks.
Rhoda, I think what you're thinking of is the Kylie Cadman expectation setting. And so just to, what that is it's a list of different activities, and the way that you're supposed to use it is sit down with your students when you're first starting and you ask them to complete it, and then you complete it. And it's about like, where is that line between what I'm being asked to do and expectations for a supervisor and what are expectations for a student, and then you compare it. And there's not necessarily like right or wrong answers, but it's about to identify that mismatch in expectations and kind of work around that really early on. So I think that institutionally, Rona's right. Like, we have a lot of new policy and guidelines in place. We have, how do you evaluate student progress and ensuring that, students are given an clear, explicit feedback. They're given a term to kind of get up to date with things, get themselves back into good standing. We have guidelines around discontinuing supervisory relationships and in ways that don't put students at financial risk. We have routes for revoking ad status so that supervisors that are engaging in supervisory practices that are not appropriate can be pulled. But I guess my one sort of thing of like, how do we advocate? It's to hold people who are in certain positions accountable for their position. So the grad chair plays a huge role for graduate students. And there are so many times when I meet with students and they don't even know who their grad officer or grad chair is. And I feel like we can't be leaving it up to new students to be trying to navigate who they're supposed to be speaking with. I think we need to ask that people reach out and open the door. And so then people say, oh, students aren't comfortable with coming to talk. And I'm like, well, I think that's a problem with what you're presenting if they're not comfortable coming to speak with you. One of the things that I will often start by sharing with students is our guide to graduate research supervision, because that outlines the responsibility of the department, of advisory committees, of the student themselves, and of the supervisor. just so you can say, like, these are appropriate expectations for you to have of your supervisor and of your department. And if those expectations are not being met at a minimum, you know, these are the channels that you can take. So it's great that we have all these guidelines and things, but we need to make sure that the people who are kind of guiding students through them know about them, and are creating a climate where students feel comfortable coming forward.
I think one of the things that I'll add, and I know we're being mindful of time. You know, I also hope that we can, especially thinking about the disruption of like the carceral logics too, especially trying to be in like an abolitionist space, and where, you know, even for folks who have done harm, you know, we don't want to do more harm. We actually want, you know, reconciliation and reparations in a way of like repairing harm, and making sure, you know, I also heard, you know, you all speaking about, you know, like accountability. Because I often, you know, think about, especially in an academic space, you know, think about like folks who have done harm. You know, there's really not like a just process of rectifying and addressing the harm. We actually just push that person way out of the way and we just let them go over there, right? You know, so I'm often, you know, just thinking about, you know, how can we like address that, you know, from the university standpoint, you know, which is inside like a settler colonial carceral logic. It's like, well, we punish them and now it's done and over with. But we never think about the, you know, the reparation of harm. You know, we don't think about repairing like the harm. We don't think about, you know, like the racial reconciliation, you know, for like, you know, when students of color like are harmed, or even, you know, like, or even when students, you know, forget, you know, content warning here, you know, I'm thinking about, you know, when students, you know, experience, you know, sexual assault and everything on campus, we don't really think about, you know, how that, you know, we just expect them just to go back, you know, to their normal process of like, okay, you got these qualifying exams, you got to get that done, you have to do all these kinds of things, without even recognizing how the structure is really ill-equipped, you know, to like deal with students who have experienced harm. You know, we're like, well, you just take time off and then you come back when you're ready. Like I feel like, you know, we should have like more of a response there. Because I always think about the harms that are done like at the graduate level. You know, we have like active predators, you know, in conference spaces. You know, and that disrupts, you know, students, you know, ability, you know, to be able to work and to like be productive. But also I think a lot of the focus is like, you know, I'm thinking about like with women, how we have to equip ourselves to like deal, you know, with predators, you know, in these spaces. You know, the burden's on us instead of like doing something like on the other end. So I just wanted to add that we're still rooted in a lot of these carceral logics. And I'm with you, Rona, you know, about doing like the preventative things. I'm about that. Thank you for adding that to the space.
Well, thank you all for the rich and varied responses to that question. There's definitely a lot to be said about how supervisors can organize the terrain of their research groups to try to structure things, to keep you know, to build those just relationships. There's also a lot to be said for equipping students with that information and that knowledge about the standards that their PIs and that their supervisors are being held to, and that there are ways to hold them accountable. But also, Kashona, I think that it's incredibly important to also recognize that so often the solution in academia is just to, well, that person's never going to teach that class again. What else are they going to teach instead? Well, that person's not going to supervise students again, but they're still going to teach classes. And we do need to think about what happens after the discipline. How do we really fully address those persons in those situations?
We also have to like look at it as a culture, right? Like when there are issues with supervisors, there is a history of it being allowed within a certain context for a certain period of time. And so when we start talking about how do we, you know, remediate this situation or whatever, it's not only the individual, it's also the whole context that I think we need to look at. And what are the ways, who are the people that are tasked with that, and what are the ways that everyone can engage in that way? Yeah, I just wanted to put apart. It's not just that in isolation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Liz. Yeah. I do have a whole host of other questions that I would love to ask, but I also want to give our attendees an opportunity to ask questions. And this is probably also a good time to also acknowledge that it looks like our friends at the Tag Lab at Concordia University, and also our friends at Serious Play at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee have also joined us from satellite viewing events, watch parties, if you will. So welcome to those folks. And yeah, if anybody has a question, feel free to raise your virtual hands or just type something into the chat. And we'll see if our panelists are able to address that.
There were some good comments in the chat that I think would be a good approach. Somewhere a good place to start. Anita, was discussing about like the care work that certain populations are burdened with, more than others. And I think that's important, like to acknowledge, especially like women, non-binary folks are do a lot of the care work for us. But also Nicole made and Anita, if you wanted to say more, I would love to hear more about your thoughts around that.
Thanks so much, Dr. Gray-Denson. Yeah, I really appreciated your words and the specificities of what you were naming in the power dynamics. So yeah, the women, queer women, women of color, doing a lot of the care because we know what it feels like. And so yeah, looking at that, maybe the question then would be, thanks, around that checklist. It seems very neutral. So the checklist is interesting. Like, what do you expect? That the one that was mentioned by Liz and Rona, I think. What do you expect? What does the supervisor expect? What does the student expect? But it is missing what you talked about, Dr. Gray-Denson, in terms of like what is missing is power, in not thought of just in an academic sense or the hierarchies of academia, because there is a whole host of other things. So I wondered if anyone had any kinds of checklists that address, what does it mean to say, what are the harms we're bringing into our relationship? This is what I've seen as a PI with Black and Indigenous people. There is a kind of a possibility that sort of struck me as a kind of Pollyanna idea from the beginning. Oh, good, I get to support people in the way that I wish I could have been supported. But then going, oh, I haven't done enough to kind of give space to the way that harms are reproduced laterally amongst communities. So I wondered if anyone here knows of that kind of a setup where it's not just given that it's a neutral objective setup, but that people come with harms so in terms of reparations and how to be aware of the harms that we bring, but not give them weight. Do you know what I mean?
Rona, Liz, because I haven't worked that much like at the administrative level, because I know just kind of the ways that we kind of scrap together, some resources, which usually it's how it starts. Folks, who are at the bottom scrap together some resources. Somebody at the top says, oh, that's a good idea. And then they implement it and institutionalize it. That was really common. Even think about, early days of Zoom, early like in the pandemic, when folks would like Zoom bomb. And then, it was like, like our queer and trans and, folks of color who are like, well, this is what you need to do to protect people, inside those spaces. And then Zoom, the institution of Zoom caught on and implemented those things because we didn't have those protections like early on, to be able to do some of that protection. So I think we can learn a lot, from like the tech space, which is what I'm in a whole lot. Also during Gamergate, how like women, were vulnerable populations and then they had to piecemeal things together for safety. And then later came trust and safety teams. So I'm really big about what Rona said about, doing that preventative kind of stuff. What can we anticipate? But I think we can only anticipate when we've got enough folks at the table who can foresee the things that might come. And that's really what's important, that we have to bring, community members, folks from, vulnerable minorities, like, conversation, we have to bring these folks together, so then we can, start to begin like a checklist, right? And I think that that's where a lot of the richness will come in whenever we're all contributing and having these conversations in the beginning, in the beginning of your project planning, before you put that proposal together, before, you deploy that research project, making sure you've thought about, okay, what are the potential harms that could come? What are the harms that we can do? What are the harms that, folks might be exposed to, because of what we're doing? I'm even thinking about me in an online space. I often ask people to go and play games online. I'm subjecting there's possible harms that could come, with me asking them to go online. So those are some of the things that I imagine, like in a checklist. And also just to recognize that it's a living document and an organic document that will change. And the key part of that is to acknowledge when we mess up. I spend most of my day apologizing, for things that, I didn't see, I didn't anticipate, for, the things that I didn't imagine, was possible. But also learning how to apologize is important too. Learning how to repair harms is like a big part. And I think that should be a part of like that checklist as well.
Thank you so much for your humility and wisdom. Appreciate it.
Anita, I was just going to say, I don't know of any specific checklist, but I just wanted to acknowledge that I think in the space of graduate supervision, we go very quickly from being supervised to being a supervisor, and there's not a whole lot of space in there to even think about, how do I want to be as a supervisor? What do I want to bring forward from my own experiences? And what are the things that I want to let go of? I think it's something that we don't provide a lot of training in our graduate programs for, and that's a real miss as a bigger picture for our academia.
Yeah, and just thinking about the whole nature of checklists, and there are a few out there. I think that they're good when they bring up conversations that are important to have, like first authorship or something like that from the start in research collaborations as well. And I think the principles are important. But it's always a bit of a toss-up. I know with our research spirit of collaboration agreements, as I mentioned, which are sort of talk about our underlying principles of how we want to work together. And we have developed more elaborate ones. And we've heard from community members, the way one of them put it was, this seems like a prenuptial arrangement that's really setting us up for divorce. And so I think we want to have checklists that make us aware of some of the possible challenges along the way, and sort of have a foundation of understanding. But I also think that we can that there's sort of a balance in terms of what works well on the ground.
Yeah, thanks for that great question, Anita. It reminds me of there was a question that someone submitted to the Eventbrite that I do want to make sure that we get to the other questions in the room, but there was a great question from the Eventbrite that's also thinking sort of laterally, as you said. What about women who are supervisors? What about racialized women who are supervisors who may be having problems with students who come from privileged positions, who may be having problems with students accepting and receiving feedback and criticism from PIs and supervisors, right, who come from non-privileged positions. So really great to think about lateral harms, both within the team and distributed in that way. But it does look like there's some other questions from the group that I'd like to make sure that we get to. I've seen, I believe Hillary's hand has been up for a while, and then there's a question in the chat from Christine, and then I saw Jack's hand come up a second ago as well. So maybe we can go in that order. Thank you.
Thank you for these wonderful, helpful comments. I have a specific follow-up for Dr. Gray-Denson, and I'm asking this with my hat of sort of the chair of our university's research ethics board on, just thinking about the great points you raised about participant remuneration. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about how researchers could figure out what the most sort of culturally appropriate, a way to remunerate participants' time is, because I can imagine some fears, especially if I, as sort of a white woman, went in and said, hey y'all, I'm offering fried chicken. Like, I could see how that could also kind of, create other kinds of harms potentially. So I'm just wondering, any more thoughts you have about how to make sure that whatever appreciation we show for people's participation in our work is tailored to that context?
I appreciate that. And you're absolutely right, Hillary. I know I said, the fried chicken piece kind of tongue in cheek, but that's a real concern. And I feel like our processes for the university are so misaligned with what community needs are. Because think about whenever we propose like these projects, a lot of times we're proposing them months and months, sometimes years in advance than when we'll actually deploy it. So we just have to kind of like guess what might, what someone might need. And I guess this is also something that the funding bodies and funding agencies, need to be aware of, because I know a lot of times when we get these grants, it's hard to change. If we said we were going to give gift cards, that's the only thing we can do with that money, right? And so I feel like a lot of these things are incongruent, and we need more of those intentional kinds of practices. So we're like, well, these gift cards aren't going to be useful in the moment. Can we change and do something else? But I also think this is what the importance of having a relationship with folks before we start research with folks. I think this is the key part, because if you're already in that relationship, then you've already done some sort of like needs assessment, and you can get a sense of what folks need, right? I remember there was one time where folks gas was increasing. Folks needed gas cards. They were like, my food stamps are covering my food. I don't need any more food, but I need gas to be able to get back and forth, right? And so we have to recognize that those needs can change. And I think that just asking folks what they need is really just like the core part, because most folks are gonna these are really simple things that folks need, basic things. And I think a lot of times we think too big and too broad about it, and then sometimes it's just very as simple as like gas cards, for folks to be able to get through like for a couple weeks. Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. So, Professor Gray, I really appreciated your comments about like canon and methods not being adequate enough for like today's kinds of research and today's concerns for that research. And I think that really resonates with me as someone who studies video games. A lot of our foundational texts, like we have Housing Homo Ludens and Roger Calloy with Man Playing Games, two white cis men conducting like kind of ethnographic research in like the 30s and 50s. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of problems with their how they were talking about the cultures. And so I was just wondering, how do you address the fact that your kind of discipline is their kind of foundation, the people and texts have a lot of really problematic elements. How do you kind of reconcile with that? Do you replace it with kind of new canon? And like, how do you kind of pick out the parts in those old canons that might still be useful, even though the people and the methods are really problematic?
So I think first off, I no matter how radical and transformative we get down here at the bottom, where we are at the bottom, the system hasn't changed. So it's also my duty and our responsibility for students to be prepared, when they, have, qualifying exams, when they go on the market. So I can't replace some of those, they still have to learn all those canon kind of things and canon pieces, right? They still have to learn the Chicago school, depending on, what field you're in. They got to learn Kant and, they got to learn Foucault, they got to learn these things no matter how problematic they are, right? But I think that we could just have like a critical discussion of where we put them into conversation with other approaches for today. I think that's how I came to the part of like Black cyberfeminism, because there was a space where cyberfeminism was not addressing like the needs of vulnerable minoritized like populations. And so I brought, Black feminist thought, intersectionality. I kind of put them like in conversation with each other. And, that's where, I came up with like, the work that I do like around Black cyberfeminism, right? But I found that there's a space to have conversations with the limitations that a lot of our methodological approaches and theoretical approaches, where they have. And so I'm always big about adding new folks to the canon. I guess I'm still shocked, for instance, that W.E.B. Du Bois is not taught just in methods classes across the board and across the disciplines, especially with the work that he did. Some folks might say, oh, that's just sociology, that's for them. I'm not a sociologist, but I still found useful work because I work in communities and, especially with a lot of the, I interview folks, I do ethnographic work. And so the work that, W.E.B. Du Bois was doing, I think is so central and so core to like what we do. So I'm big about, I think a lot about, the politics of what we include on syllabi, right? So I make sure that there's not just a week of like, okay, here's the week for queer folks, here's the week for Indigenous folks, here's the week for Black folks. That's interwoven, throughout everything that we do, and we put them together and have conversations with them together because I value, all those approaches together. So I think we're seeing a lot of changes and a lot of movement around that. And I think that it's, I'm not one of those people where we throw away all the dead white guys. That's not, I'm like, no, there's plenty that we can still learn, and there's still generative conversations that can be had. We're just adding to, it's, we just add to those voices, Yeah. Thank you for asking that, Jack. Jack does amazing work around like Pokemon Go. By the way, I know a lot of you all who know my work know that I'm very invested in that Pokemon Go space. And so Jack's really working and looking at how we can approach, because Pokemon Go is this geolocation service that really focuses on the land. And so making sure that we engage in decolonial ways too. So amazing work there, Jack. I wanted to shout you out there. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. You're too kind.
And we are very much at the end of our time, but I do want to ask if Liz or Rona, if you wanted to follow up on that last question from Jack as well. It does seem to implicate some of the things, for instance, Liz, that you mentioned in response to one of the previous questions, that it's not just about the bad behavior of individuals, but it's about the culture from out of which those individuals develop their practices and approaches.
I don't think I have anything to add to what's already been stated. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, no, I'm good. I loved Kashona's answer, and I've got to go do some research on Black cyber feminism.
All right.
I love that. And I feel like I'm going to see you all soon. I know you have to end this, but I think I'm going to be visiting up there soon. So I'll make sure, Gerald, if you make connections for me, that would be great.
That's wonderful. I'd love to hear more about that. Unfortunately, we are concluding now. I do see that there's another hand. We've only asked the panelists for an hour of their time. I believe that this was scheduled until 1:15 in case there were technical hiccups, or excuse me, until 2:15 in case there were technical hiccups or the like. But we'd only requested an hour of our panelists' time for this. And I just want to repeat, as I said at the start, thank you all so much for contributing to this conversation, for bringing your expertise, your perspective, your insight, and your knowledge about these matters, and especially for being willing to share that and to also share your advice with our audience here and hopefully in posterity as well. Thank you all so much, and please let's give our panelists a round of virtual applause to show them our appreciation.
Thanks so much for the invitation, Gerald, and thanks, fellow panelists. This was an interesting conversation. I appreciated it.
Yeah. Thanks. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.